what you could say at the end of the day is, I don't know if that perfect fragrance really exists, because I think the best fragrance actually have some imperfections. There's something a little bit off, or something a little bit out of balance, something that sticks out. I think that is actually very important for a fragrance to be memorable, to be recognized, and to have like a true personality, a soul of its own, I like to say sometimes. So.
I just wanted to say hi, Frank. It's nice to see you again.
Hi, Brittney. Pleasure to be with you. I remember those great years we spent together, Firmenich, when you were part of our team. And I'm excited to speak with you today.
So you have had an absolutely iconic career. But take me back to the first time you actually felt like, I'm officially a perfumer.
Well,
when did you know? Like, when did you really feel like you arrived?
Well, yeah, a good question. And it's honestly, sometimes today I feel I haven't arrived yet. So it's like, because it's such a long process and you continue learning. So it's and maybe that's also what makes it interesting, and it's what I love about it, because it's not like, okay, now I know it all, and from now on we'll just repeat what we did and what we've learned. And it's not like that. There's some of it is it, but in terms of timeline, I would say between all the training, it takes around 5 years until you sort of know a little bit what you're doing, which is a long time.
That is a long time.
And it's sometimes interesting how you see people becoming perfumers overnight.
Yes.
You really wonder how they did that,
The YouTube video. I want to get back in a time machine and talk about you, Frank. I know you were born in Germany, and you spent a lot of time in France. And you also spent a lot of time and had a lot of happy moments on your uncle's farm. Could you tell us a little bit more about your experiences and kind of how that shaped you to become the perfumer you are today?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think when it comes to olfactive, our childhood is sort of very determining for all of us. And that doesn't mean that we all going to become perfumers one day. I remember very vividly those moments at my uncle's farm. I would spend there a few weeks in the summer. My parents would leave me there. So it was also my first experience alone, and with my grandmother. And it was a good moment and very intense moment. And the farm is, I mean, when it comes to olfactive, it's very intense. And not only good smells, obviously.
Yes.
But that's fine. And I have to say, until today, those, what people would probably mostly describe as unpleasant smells, they bring back good memories, because I was happy on that farm and playing around as a kid and playing with other kids there and running around, being in the, harvesting the hay, and, helping out in the stable with the cows and the horses. So a lot of very strong smells there. But I have positive associations to them. So I don't really mind them. And then I think it gets a little bit more glamorous, because in Paris, then later as an adolescent, I experienced, my first exposure to fragrance, to perfumes. And I mean, that was, I would say, late 70s, early 80s. And there was a time where, I mean, still today, I would say, but Paris is a very fragrant city. And it's more about the good smells besides the subway.
I think you could say the same thing about New York as well.
But there's definitely people wear fragrance almost every day. And, wherever you go, you will always smell beautiful fragrances, some very powerful fragrances. And especially the 80s was what I like to call loud, in terms of olfactive signature. And so I started going to a perfumery store in the Rue de Rivoli and smelling fragrances. I didn't have a lot of money yet as a teenager, so once in a while I would treat myself buying a piece of soap or something, or a deo stick, because I couldn't afford the perfume. So that was kind of my way to get in, and then I would get little samples if I was lucky, and then I would wear them, and eventually I would save my money and then buy the perfume.
Wow.
So,
what made you go in those stores?
That's a very good question. I mean, to be honest, I don't really know. I just I don't know the answer.
You just gravitated towards fragrance.
Yes. I just went there and I was interested in perfumes, and I didn't even know that the métier of the perfume existed. And I started collecting fragrance, so. And then coincidentally, a friend of my parents knew about the ISIPCA, which is a school in Versailles and, next to Paris, that I eventually went to, and I learned about perfumery and that there's people creating fragrance. And I said, okay, that's what I want to do.
So when did you know you wanted to be a perfumer? I know you touched on it a little bit, but what was that catalyst for saying, you know what, I'm going to pursue perfumery as a career?
Yeah. So it was really in those teenage years. So I was around 16, 17, I would say 16, 17, 18. And it's really when I had an interview with the director of that school. So after my parents' friend told us about it, I went there, and they were very nice with me. And I actually happened to be the first German going to that school. So they were really excited. Because they wanted to be international, but they were quite French back then.
Yes.
Because they were not well known as a school. And this director from the school, he was super nice, and he explained me that there's different parts of the business. There's people who trade with raw materials, and then there's people who do marketing, and there's people who do the evaluation, and then there are those who actually create the perfume itself. And I think it's really in that moment that I said, okay, I think that's exactly what I would like to do. And yeah.
How long was your perfumery training? I don't think a lot of people know how intensive the training is and how long it takes to become a perfumer. So could you tell us about your experience training to become a perfumer?
Yeah, it's actually before starting at that school, I had to do some chemistry. I had to do a bachelor in chemistry, and to tell you the truth, I really kind of hated it. So it's like, I have to say those were very difficult years at college before joining that school to get my degree and my bachelor degree in chemistry. And but somehow I did it. Then I was training at the school for 2 years, where you sort of get the big picture, do a little bit of formulating on ingredients, and learning how to smell and learning about all the ingredients that we use. It's like the color palette for a painter, so that's our ingredient palette. And then you work with perfumer, and then it's sort of transmitted. It's like a craft, I almost feel like sometimes a carpenter, knows a lot of little tricks on how to work with wood and what the different woods are like, and what are all the little secrets on how to do things, how to put them together, and make everything work. And I think in perfume it's a little bit like that as well. It's a craft that you have to sort of transmit. So the best way is to really have good mentors, have perfumers who are willing also to share. Because not everybody does. But yeah, and so I was lucky in that perspective.
So let's fast forward to 2005, the year you joined Firmenich.
Yeah.
What were those early days at Firmenich like for you?
Well, there was, I would say, as well exciting as quite overwhelming. because up to then I had worked with smaller companies. I worked many years at Voelkl, where I also had a great mentor, Maurice Roussel, who really, I think, also took my skills to another level, I would say, and who was very willing to share his knowledge, the wealth of knowledge that he has. And but Jagoku was a small structure, and for a perfumer, it's can be very different to be exposed to, let's say, 2-3 clients and maybe 10 projects or 15 projects a year versus joining a business industry leader like Firmenich and suddenly being exposed on basically to all the brands, all the clients, and so many projects. On top of that, a lot of molecules and ingredients that are captive and that I've never seen before and smelled before. So kind of felt a little bit like a kid in a candy store,
Yes.
exploring all these beautiful new things that came up to me. And so it was very, very exciting. And changing a company and starting a new stage as a perfumer is always a bit stressful because you have to rebuild your collection and start every fragrance from scratch and so on. But it's also refreshing. And I have to say, until today, 17 years later, I'm so happy to be with Firmenich, and it's a family company. So there's still a spirit there, community that I feel I belong to, and it's very very rewarding. The way we work as a perfumer is basically we have new projects coming to us from brands like Scentbird or any other brand. They come to us and they brief us on new projects. So sometimes they're very specific, sometimes they are more general. So we get to work for this project. And then since it's a very competitive business, I mean, I think a lot of people think it's so glamorous and we're just, sitting there in our desk and creating and dreaming and, and then, somebody buys the fragrance and everybody is happy. So there are beautiful moments in my work, but there are also more difficult moments because, to tell you the truth, I think in average, 10% of the projects I work on I probably go through, which means there's 90% of the fragrances that will probably not be retained because a lot of times you have, 5, 10 perfumers, 20, 25 perfumers, big projects, even more perfumers, they will work. And at the end of the day, the client will launch one fragrance. So imagine, sometimes you work several fragrances for one project, and then you have so many different perfumers who work on the same project. And then, depending on how well you match the expectation of the client or the consumer, your fragrance will be chosen or not. So basically, there's a lot of work that happens. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes those fragrances that are not being retained on a project doesn't necessarily mean that they were not perfect or were not a good fragrance. So you can sort of work on themes continuously over the years. And that's what I mean with building a collection, So all these fragrances that were not retained on the project, they will still be there, and we can maybe one day when we go back to them, we can, do something else with them or take them to another level, So without having projects, we also do work and generate new innovation and new innovative ideas, which is a lot of fun. So there's a continuous, besides all the projects we work on, there's a continuous process of creation.
And that's part of your collection, right?
Exactly. And then they become my collection.
Let's talk about that, though. So how would you Well, maybe we can talk about it from this perspective. Like, I'd like to start talking about the craft and the art of perfumery. As
Yeah.
you've mentioned, it's an art and a science put together, and it takes a while to develop the tools of the trade. So, could you tell us a little bit about how a fragrance is actually made, how it's initiated, and then how it gets all the way to market, and in the role of the perfumer in that process?
I mean, it is a long process and it depends because some fragrance I can work on sometimes for years. So the time for the development is a very long process. Others can be faster, can be 3 months or 6 months. But basically, the way it starts is that whatever my intention is, so whether it's proactive or for specific brief or brand project, as a perfumer, you kind of start, thinking of an idea, what you're trying to do. And then it's almost okay. Then you start going to your palette and choose the ingredients that you would like to use, and that will help you to realize in an olfactive way this idea. So it basically starts in your brain. You imagine something that you would like it to smell like, and then you sort of put it together physically, more or less, by blending those ingredients in different proportions. And so we create a formula. I like to compare that formula sometimes to a recipe, when you cook and you need this amount of this ingredient and this amount of that ingredient, and then you sort of have to blend them. In perfume, we just blend everything together in one, beaker, let's say. So there's not this whole frying and whatever, you know what I mean. So we blend all these ingredients in one together. We make a solution in alcohol, we smell it, and then we decide whether we like the proportions of the ingredients that we chose. And from then you start modifying that formula. So you just keep trying and put a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that. You might add something, you might take something out. So it's almost like shaping until you get to a place where you think, all right, this is kind of what I was trying to do. It's kind of matching the idea I had in my mind. And then you share it with somebody. You share it with an evaluator that you work with in your office, and then eventually you share it with your client, and then they will tell you what they think.
Yes. So after that process, let's say they really like maybe 2 of the fragrances that you've shared or created for them. How does that become one fragrance that goes to market?
Well, I would say there's 2 scenarios. One of them could be that maybe if they like those 2 fragrances so much that they will say, well, maybe we can take this part of this fragrance and that part of that fragrance and sort of bring them together. So we do that sometimes. Or you just continue working both fragrances, and eventually they will say, well, we still like that second fragrance, but this one is really the one we want to go with. And then, they move forward with that. So there's a lot of options, but eventually there will be one fragrance in the bottle, and that's what makes it also challenging, and but even so more rewarding when your fragrance is the one chosen to go in the bottle.
Yes, it's a long competitive journey with starts and stops and evaluation and feedback.
Yes. Yeah.
And then, at the end of the day, if your selection gets picked, then it goes in the bottle, and then the marketing starts.
Exactly. And we, by the way, we are not so much part of that. So when it comes to packaging and, blending the fragrance oil with the alcohol and the water and putting it in a bottle and then creating the packaging, the marketing campaign, etc., we don't get involved in that part. So that is really then basically for us, it stops when we sort of finished the fragrance oil, to a level where I said, okay, this is that's it. We're approving this fragrance as it is right now. That formula obviously is our intellectual property of Firmenich. So that is that secret formula will be also exclusive. So we will not use this for anybody else than for this client, for this project. And and then everything else is then, I would say, taken to the next level by our clients.
Yes. It's a long journey from the brand briefing you or the fragrance creator, the conceptor, to you making it a reality, to the trial and error and the testing, all the way until it hits the shelves and makes millions and millions of people happy.
Yeah. And by the way, I think it is important to know that sometimes we have hundreds, sometimes thousands of trials until we get to that final. So it can be pretty extensive. I mean, it can sometimes be a couple of thousand trials before we really get to the point where we say, okay, this is it.
How do you personally, as a perfumer, know when a fragrance is done, so to speak, and ready to present?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's a tough question because honestly, I could finish a fragrance one day and go back to it a year later and say, I want to change this. I want to change that.
Wow.
Obviously, once it's being, marketed, it will not be changed. So it will stay as is. But as a perfumer, and even when I wear fragrances myself, my brain is constantly thinking and always thinking about, I like this and I don't like that, and this I could do different. And so there's a constant stimulation in a way where you always just think about, okay, this is done or it's not done. And I think what you could say at the end of the day is, I don't know if that perfect fragrance really exists because I think the best fragrance actually have some imperfections. There's something a little bit off or something a little bit out of balance, something that sticks out. I think that is actually very important for a fragrance to be memorable, to be recognized, and to have like a true personality, a soul of its own, I like to say sometimes. So
yes, I've heard you say that before, that the best fragrances have that element of imperfection. You just mentioned it again here. Could we talk a little bit more about what you mean by that and how that lends itself to fragrance? What are those imperfections? I know you said they stand out, but I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about the imperfections that you speak of.
So I think the best way to describe it is that if you have an image, or in this case the image being the scent is a blend of ingredients, and they all have different proportions and they all play different roles within that blend, and within that perfume. And I think the imperfections would be, let's say, one facet of that fragrance being a little bit exaggerated, or it could even be something missing that you would expect to be there. I'm just saying something. I'm just making something up. Let's say in jasmine, you have, an animalic note, which there's one ingredient called indole. And so you could have a jasmine and it's missing the indole, So there could be some type of distortion there. Or the jasmine also has a fruity note, so you could do the jasmine and just leave out the fruity note. So, it's kind of a balance of what you would expect to be there or not to be there, and leave something out or put something that doesn't belong there, and it's more like the versus an expectation, so. Or you could also do it by, I did that with one brand particularly. We also said, we'll just skip the freshness. We always think, okay, every fragrance has to have a top note, and there has to always be something fresh and clean because everybody loves that. And it is true. It is true, that people love to have freshness in a fragrance, and you just purposely leave it out. Say, okay, you know what? We don't want. Forget about the freshness. We'll just leave that out, and then we'll just leave the fragrance as is. And if somebody wants freshness, well, then go buy a fresh fragrance.
They could see something else.
Yeah. So you could call that an imperfection because you're missing the freshness. So that's kind of how it is, and that is really interesting, and I love to work that way, to do something that you distort that expectation and you just do the opposite. I actually like to do that in life as well, when I see everybody going this way, I like to go the other way.
Would you say that's your signature, to play up imperfections or to kind of rebel against what is traditional?
Yeah, I mean, you could call it rebellious, but it's also, I think, a form of innovation and a form to innovate and a form to try to be different. And yeah. I'm certainly not the only one working that way. I would not pretend that, but I do enjoy working that way.
That's awesome. That's so cool. It's like, I guess that's how you create a fragrance that becomes truly iconic, or a fragrance that people love so much. It's because you don't go the same direction as everyone else does. You play up something that is unexpected, maybe for that brief or for that brand or for that customer. And I know you've said that your goal is to craft scents that evoke a profound emotion or a profound emotional connection. Can you kind of expand on what you're striving for when you say that?
Yeah, I really think that beyond wearing fragrance to seduce another person, I mean, for many, many years, that's how fragrance have been advertised to us. Yeah. Let's face it. And they still are for certain brands. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but I would say that at the end of the day, the role of fragrance to me, it's more profound than making others react and or trying to please to others. And I have to say, even when I think about my own kids growing up and the way they are and behave, somehow I feel like this trend of trying to please always is not as important as it used to be, maybe, how we were brought up, like you have to be nice and you need to look good and, be perfectly, dressed, etc., and present yourself, etc. So anyway, I think it is important that a fragrance really makes you feel good. And so I don't think anybody would wear a fragrance that they hate but just to get attention from others.
Right.
Because I think it could be very disturbing, and it has happened to me as well, to wear a fragrance or something that I loved maybe 20 years ago, and I would wear it today, and suddenly I'm like, oh my God, this is not, get this off of me, So it does happen, and there's an emotional connection. So of course, what we try to do as a perfumer is to create fragrance that will create this connection with the consumer we are creating for, with the person we are creating for. And I think that's really the key. So it's really all about making you go to places, be transportive. That could be one way. To feel confident, to feel clean, to feel comfortable, and to feel sensual. I mean, whatever you like to feel like, and it can be a combination of some of these. But that's really what personally I'm always looking for, is because that's the most beautiful thing. And I even think that to some extent, fragrance can even have something almost healing about it. That means that it makes you feel so good that whenever you wear that fragrance, or maybe because it reminds you of a loved one or loving person you love or something like that, or a place you love that it makes you feel so good and transports you there. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And that's kind of what I'm driving for.
So I'd love to start talking about some of your creations. You've had a wonderful career. It's been 30 years in the business. Some of the best loved fragrances were actually created by you. I wanted to give you your flowers on that because people don't typically remember that there is a person, a trained perfumer that's behind some of our favorite scents. But let's talk about some of the fragrances you've created. One of my personal favorites that I know you've created is Glossier You. And I loved that campaign about the fragrance being for you. But there's also something that adapts to each individual. So I was wondering if you could tell us about how you went about creating a fragrance for Glossier You.
Just first, I need to know that, it was a fragrance together that was a collaboration with Dora Baghriche, so a perfumer in Paris and a colleague in our French office.
Shout out to Dora.
And exactly. So it was really interesting because when we were working on this with Emily Weiss, the founder of Glossier, who was actually very much into fragrance and who was very, very involved into that creation process. And so while we were working on this and talking with her, I also shared with her my view on how fragrance is really for you, So we kind of, in our discussions brought this up, and it's, Glossier You is more like almost like a skin scent. It's not the type of fragrance that you wear almost like a layer. For me, there's a difference between a perfume and a scent, actually. And I'll explain you. So it's, for me, a perfume is more like your Gucci sunglasses or your handbag or a Chanel handbag or any type of accessory you would wear, like as a embellishing, ornamental kind of accessory. And a scent to me is more something that you would wear for yourself, that becomes part of you, and that you basically, it smells like you, and it becomes part of you. It's not like wearing something flashy or very visible. It's more this type of fragrance, like I say, it becomes part of you. And I thought it was really cool how they advertise it eventually about, basically you are the main ingredient, so you wear this fragrance and then it becomes part of your body, and it sort of mingles, and there's this interaction that makes it smell like you. And that is very different from this fragrance that you wear, and that is like very, perfumey maybe, or more like ornamental.
For others to see. The difference between a scent and a perfume is kind of who sees it first. It's the perfume is the accessory, and the scent is how it makes you feel, or it's something more personal. So cool.
Yeah.
I think this is a new definition that everyone should follow: perfume versus scent. But going back to Glossier You, how did you go about figuring out how to express this idea of scent being for you through the notes?
So together with Dora started this idea with a very simple, like a very straightforward accord. And that's also, I think, to further elaborate on the scent versus the perfume, I think a scent has something a little bit more linear. And it's probably a little bit more simplistic in its structure. And maybe a little bit less facets. I'm not saying Glossier You doesn't have facets, because it does, but it's probably, it overall feels more as one piece. versus some fragrance that have a very clear evolution from the top note to the mid to the back. And then, the top smells very different than the back. You could have this freshness we spoke about before. And then you could have this floral part, hard, and then it can evolve into something musky, woody. So a scent for me, and Glossier You, for example, is a type of fragrance that you see what you get, and it's basically from top to bottom, from the moment you apply it until wear the day throughout you wearing it, it sort of stays the same. And so it's really, it's more linear. That's what we call more linear versus maybe more faceted and with a less evolution within the moment you wear it. Yeah.
Right. Frank, could you tell us a little bit more about the brand Nomenclature? I understand that the fragrances are all based on molecules, so I was looking forward to hearing more about how you develop for that brand.
Yeah, it's quite unique, and as you know, I'm an advocate of using molecules and giving them their place in our product. And so what's really interesting about that brand is that they really use the molecule as a sort of hero ingredient in their perfume. So we basically started building a fragrance around one singular molecule and basically thinking of the molecule, what it evokes, and what are the associations of it, and sort of just add to that central molecule that we sort of overdose within that fragrance, and add actually also naturals and other molecules, etc. So it's a very unique approach, and it's a really cool brand.
Yeah,
very New York.
I love that. Could you tell us about some of the specific creations you've done for Nomenclature, or what note or molecule it's based off of?
Yeah, the latest one, it's called Redwood, and it's really cool because there is an ingredient in there. It's called Clearwood, and it's our biotech patchouli. So it's really very innovative because I like to call it in vitro patchouli because it's sort of we were able to isolate the DNA of the patchouli and sort of regrow it with sugars and enzymes in a lab. And so genetically, the Clearwood is patchouli, but grown in a lab.
Wow.
And that's kind of the main ingredient there. And then, Psycho was the other one that's kind of more like a retro molecule, the coumarin. I mean, we all know tonka, and so it's a main ingredient of tonka beans, and it has this very creamy almondy note. And so it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy working with them.
So cool. I love that. It almost sounds like Clearwood is like an impossible burger. I don't know if I'm just hungry, but it's like you've recreated something in a lab that like maintains its authenticity. It's really interesting.
And it is 100% natural and sustainable. Very important.
See that? All the benefits.
Yeah.
So I also wanted to talk about a brand that is available on the Scentbird platform, Commodity. And I know you've worked on some of the fragrances there. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of your favorite creations from that brand?
Yeah, I mean, I did one fragrance for them, and it's called Bois. It's a wood, so it's a French word for wood, and that was mine. And so the idea there was to create a very let's say creamy interpretation of wood. Wood sometimes can be a little bit dry, can be earthy, it can be something almost, I would say, uncomfortable. So I would try. This fragrance was more about, like this fluidity, to find this smoothness and fluidity, sensuality within the wood. So there's some sandalwood, cedarwood note. I would say mostly what I like to call blonde woods. So that like the lighter woods, rather than the dark woods, which are like the vetiver and the patchouli. So that was a lot of fun, and I'm very happy that brand has reemerged and is back available to us.
Absolutely, and I know they have kind of different expressions of their scents now. Like it's kind of like some of the fragrances where there's eau de toilette, eau de parfum or an extrait or something. I'm probably butchering some of those words, but I think they have kind of like the personal fragrance. Have you done different expressions of the Bois fragrance with them?
No, we
No?
have done the, like the eau de parfum. I think that's like the main, product they have, and yeah. So it's like eau de parfum is like these terms that you were using, the extrait and eau de parfum, parfum. There's a lot of times they're different fragrance levels actually. So the concentration of the fragrance is different. But a lot of brands these days actually also change the fragrance. So when they do the parfum version or the extrait version or the eau de parfum, eau de toilette, it's become very trendy to really shift the fragrance significantly.
Wow. Yeah, definitely. So, next, I'd love to explore a few major areas where Firmenich is really pioneering and shaping the future of fragrance. And we touched on sustainability, but could you tell us a little bit more about the sustainability initiatives at Firmenich?
Yeah. So it's really exciting, and I think probably also again my German roots. The environment has always been something very precious and very important, and there's always been that awareness. And I have to say I'm proud that Firmenich and our chairman these days used to be the CEO Patrick Firmenich has always has been very keen on Firmenich being one of at the forefront of those initiatives.
I'm with Gilbert Gostin, CEO of Firmenich, the world's largest privately owned perfume and taste company. More than half of the world's population interact with one of Firmenich's products every single day, but it's still a family-owned company with sustainability at its core. Gilbert, why is sustainability such an important principle for Firmenich?
Sustainability has been ingrained in our history and at the same time in our DNA as an organization. When our founding fathers put together the values of the company, sustainability was one of them. It is at the heart of our inclusive capitalism business model. So this is part of our way of doing business. At the same time, it is important for the planet because you need 3.5 tons of petal rose to make 1 kilo of rose essential oil that we use in your soaps, in your perfumes, in your shampoos. So the only way is to harvest it in a very sustainable way.
So it's not something that's happened in the last 2 years. It's been, I would say, probably 10 years that we have started initiatives, and I'm really proud of that. I would say in recent years, initially, it has become a little bit challenging to start formulating under sustainable criteria. And I have to admit that, the first projects that came to me where it had to be 90% biodegradable ingredients and a certain amount of carbon renewable ingredients in the formula, etc., that was quite a challenge. And I like to call it like brain gymnastics to work on these projects because you really have to twist let's say everything you've learned until now and sort of rethink everything, because not only suddenly you're trying to find certain hedonics, you also try to create the most sustainable fragrance that there could be.
Wow.
So it's been a very interesting challenge, and I have to say now I love it. And honestly, we have tools that are really helping us to calculate all these things while we develop our formulas, and we can see, all right, this fragrance is 99% biodegradable, and there's upcycled ingredient in there. So there's, it's a little bit all about the fact that people are looking for transparency. I think that's kind of a trend, and I feel it's a little bit where it's coming from. It's the awareness of the environment and how important it is to preserve our planet, but it's also the increasing curiosity to know about where things come from, what's in them, and I think that is something that has really changed a little bit the landscape of how we create of perfumery and how we create fragrances.
If you were to create a fragrance that's considered sustainable, how would you define those parameters, what would make a fragrance sustainable? Is it a percentage of naturals? Is it where a percentage of them is sourced? What makes that equation to get a sustainable fragrance?
The ingredients, of course, we want to make sure that whatever we use, that it's being replanted, and so we don't exhaust nature's
supply.
reserve. And that's we touched on it earlier. That's why I also think that this mix of molecules and naturals is a healthier one, because if we will all start using 100% natural fragrances, basically we would empty our forests and fields very fast, and there wouldn't be enough ingredients around to fragrance the world.
Right. We deplete all of nature.
Nature is a much better chemist than we'll ever be. And in fact, most of our iconic ingredients were inspired by nature. Nature really guides our research and innovation. Nature helps us decide what molecules to make and how to make it.
You know, we have sometimes brands that come to us that are looking for 100% natural, and we always have this conversation like, okay, what is your intention really? And I think it's important for everybody to understand, if you want to do good, probably the 100% natural fragrance is not necessarily the best way of doing good and doing justice to nature and the environment. So, we try to find the right way and be responsible mostly.
Yeah, responsibility and transparency. I think that is kind of the new wave. It's what people want in their products. So, in addition to the evolution of fragrance and speaking about sustainability, how do you think, and we touched on this a little bit, but how do you think gender has changed, or the perspective of gender has changed the fragrance industry in recent years?
There has been, let's say, a way of creating fragrance that maybe have a little bit less of a point of view, because we're trying to please everybody. So that's kind of always a fine line. So I think that's how a lot of small brands have emerged, because there was a category of consumers who were looking more for the point of difference and to differentiate themselves, to be more individualist and to sort of make a statement that, they're wearing a fragrance that not everybody else is wearing.
Mm-hmm.
And those fragrances have been created mostly without really a gender in mind. Because when you think about it, if you start thinking of creating a man's fragrance or a women's fragrance, you probably, as a perfumer, would be tempted to go to certain types of ingredients. Right?
Flowers for women, woods for men.
Exactly. So when you do that, you sort of more easily get into one type of fragrance, And I mean, there's a lot of variety, of course. I'm sort of simplifying it a little bit. But when you don't think in terms of gender, you're basically probably, I mean, at least for myself, in my mind, it makes me very free. It frees me up in a way where, I don't have to think of whether a man or woman is wearing this. So I can just put things together that maybe nobody was thinking of before, and associate the flower with the wood and the spice and the amber and the iris and you name it, and not think, that I have to have like a DNA that is more gender specific. So that's one thing happening over the last 10 years.
I love it.
And I think, on the other hand, in society, and I certainly think that's a good thing, the gender specificity. Oh, how do you say it?
I don't know. Gender specificity.
Gender specificity has also become something that is more important, and where we want to be more inclusive, and where we want to acknowledge that there's not only men born as men and women born as women. And that is, so I think that has just become something that is very important in our society, at least in our Western society here and in the US and in Europe. Unfortunately, some markets still struggling with that.
Right.
But definitely you could say there has been an openness and people thinking maybe in a little bit more liberal way. So that has also sort of nurtured the fact that, also the brands we work with try to be maybe less traditional or less conservative or less boxed in their marketing approach. And so I think it's an interesting trend, and there's brands that have emerged that we also work with. And I think it sort of broadened the spectrum. Again, I think it's just allows us to innovate more and to be less framed in.
Yeah. I love what you said about, it giving you freedom. I think it's freedom all around, freedom for the customer, as well as, or it's transferred from freedom for the perfumer to create based on maybe a moment or an ingredient or a place or a vibe, as opposed to a gender. And then that also frees up the customer. I love the idea of pushing beyond gender, being more free for everyone. It just seems like it expands everyone's horizons.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I know we've talked about artificial intelligence a little bit. Is there any other aspect of artificial intelligence coming through for the fragrance industry that you think is exciting or helpful to the future of the industry?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because we are starting to work with artificial intelligence now.
Ooh, tell me more.
So, yeah, we have been actually, our creation tool already provides us safety regulatory checks and so on. So our formula will just be run through an algorithm, and, they will tell us whether we're good or we're not, and we're safe or not. So we have also taken that to another level where we basically can enter criteria what we think a fragrance should smell like or want it to smell like. And then our internal system that actually has a funny name, but I won't say it because I don't think
Please
I
tell
won't be
us.
allowed. But anyway, so we have a system, and it'll create formulas for us. So it's interesting because amongst perfumers, we're always joking about it. And, perfumers, there's less than astronauts in the world. So, and, usually they make a good living, and we've always been joking, that if they could replace us, they would. Actually, my friend and former colleague, Harry Fremont, he always had this comparison that talking about computer-aided design. And, how architects, they use tools to design houses and to calculate static and all these technical aspects of it. So what's interesting about it is that you don't have to worry so much about all the technical aspects, and you don't have to worry about price and safety and regulatory, and the focus can really be mainly on the creation, and to really worry about how you innovate and how you also can be helped with the performance of your fragrance, because there's also that aspect. Everybody is expecting the fragrance to be diffusive and long-lasting and have all these technical characteristics that we take for granted, but they are actually, they have to be developed. And as a perfumer, we also have to keep these things in mind. So there is all this artificial intelligence that we have available to us through our tools that we can use and to just assist us to maybe get a little bit faster from A to B than we used to. And I really love that. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that comparison. It's like a CAD program. It's not doing the work, it's setting a foundation or a basis. It's really interesting.
Yeah. And there's different layers to it. And we've been working on this already for many years, and we're sort of, trying to take it little by little on a high level, to the point, like I mentioned, that we are basically telling our robot, let's say,
What's the robot's name?
please create a rose fragrance or a coconut fragrance, and it'll sort of spit out a formula, create a formula that we will then compound, and that's supposed to smell like a coconut or a rose. And so that's really cool. So that is really, I think, the stage we're at right now. And then you can certainly also imagine all other sorts of things, work on line extensions, how we have to translate the fine fragrance to maybe the body lotion or the soap or the deo, etc.
Right.
You could also imagine then eventually having a software basically doing that translation to you if you enter all the criteria of how the base smells, etc. So I think there's no limit, and I love that.
Being even in your working for Firmenich and seeing all of the fragrances you've developed. But if you were to look back and talk to a younger Frank Voelkl, when you were in Paris just starting to discover the fragrance world, what would you tell him?
How hard it really is to get there. It's like, it is, you need a lot of resilience, really, I have to say. And I think, especially in a fragrance company, probably a lot of people look up to our work and what we do as perfumers. And sometimes maybe they even envy us, but it's also, you need to really have a pretty thick skin and deal with the daily successes and failures that you have to experience. And you have to really be able to pursue your vision every day and not get distracted and not get discouraged by the things you have to experience. And I don't want to dramatize it, but it is, it's a very competitive business these days, and there are high expectations, and so yeah, you have to stay focused, and it's very important to make the right choices. I mean, in any métier, but so maybe not always made the best choices, but somehow I've always got, back on track, and somehow it worked out,
So thank you so much, Frank, for talking with us about all things fragrance and about your wonderful career.
Thank you, Brittney. It was a true pleasure and a lot of fun, actually. Thank you.
Yes.